Well, welcome to the Tuesday Night Talk with Executive Director Lee Reed of the Atlanta Citizen Review Board. I'm Charles Curry, the Outreach Specialist and Public Information Officer for the ACRB. I'm filling in for Communication Specialist Melissa Jean-Baptiste, who is under the weather this evening. So if this is your first time tuning into our podcast, I'll ask Mr. Reed to give us a brief introduction to the ACRB, who we are, and what we do. Lee Reed, good evening.
All right, thank you, Brother Charles. Appreciate it. Glad to have you on tonight, filling in for Melissa. So the ACRB was started in 2007. Actually, legislation was passed in 2007 after the death of Miss Katherine Johnson, who was killed in 2006 by Atlanta police officers. In 2008, we opened our doors and started receiving complaints. Since that time, we have grown and we have changed our ordinance to be able to address the concerns of citizens more adequately. That's one of the benefits of having civilian oversight, is that as citizens express their concerns, we're able to examine them and see if we need to make changes to our policies, to our ordinance, to be able to better serve their needs. So really, that's the nuts and bolts of how we were created. And then you have our functional areas, which are basically investigations, mediations, and community outreach. All of that is under our umbrella. One of the main things that we like to encourage citizens to do is be involved with the agency, be it receiving information, participating in our focus groups, our outreach activities, providing us questions, contacting us about any concerns that you may have related to the ACRB or policing in general. That's my take on the ACRB for right now. Let's roll.
Let's roll. Well, this evening we'll be taking a look at what it takes to form an independent, transparent civilian oversight agency like the ACRB. Now, as you know, Director Reed, there have been other versions of the ACRB in the city, but it was the killing of that 92-year-old grandmother by the APD 15 years ago last week that resulted in a more comprehensive agency with a dedicated staff. So if you will, please share with us how that attack on her home in Vine City by corrupt officers of the Atlanta Police Department led to us to being here this evening.
Well, Charles, I'm glad you brought that up because, yes, the current ACRB is the third iteration of civilian oversight in Atlanta. The two prior formations of civilian oversight were really organized to where you had citizen participation in the oversight, but it did not have the dedicated staff. So what happened is that the police department was doing the investigations, and sometimes the boards at that time would meet sporadically. They wouldn't get all the information, and things were it was a much longer drawn out process, and it became unwieldy. With the death of Miss Johnston, all the issues with those formations of civilian oversight came to the forefront, and citizens demanded something more substantial. And that's when the leadership of the city and the demands of the public agreed that they needed to have something more substantial. And it wasn't just walk in and let's just do it. It was because of the community's pressure. It was because of the community's involvement. It was because of that demand that the elected officials said, okay, we need to address this. And that's how they came up with independent oversight that included dedicated staff, because somebody has to do this work every day. Somebody has to do this work. And it only makes sense because police officers are on the street every day.
That's right.
Right? Police officers are having contact with citizens every day. And the ultimate goal is, how do we have the best policing that reflects the community, the desires and wishes of the community, and can establish trust with those that we say, please come into our communities to serve and protect, to address community concerns as it relates to crime. That's what this civilian oversight is about.
It's kind of interesting. I was talking to our supervisor, Maola Smith, today and trying to figure out why does it have to take something like the death of a 92-year-old grandmother for everyone to coalesce immediately, and make this kind of thing happen? I mean, very often, as you know, it takes a long time for these kinds of oversight agencies to be developed. But when you find out that there's something that's happening in your community as tragic as the death of a 92-year-old grandmother, all of a sudden, all of these different agencies, all of these different people, the citizens, they tend to come together to try to make something happen. Why does it have to go to that length in order for something to happen right away?
Well, unfortunately, because a 92-year-old grandmother shocks the conscience of her being killed by the police in her home. A 92-year-old grandmother? That's troubling. When Minneapolis, where I came from before I was here, they started civilian oversight in the early 90s because two elderly people in their 80s were killed behind the same type of raid.
Another tragic event
that shocked the conscience. It's like, wait a minute. That's not to say that other deaths by police officers do not shock the conscience. But when you're talking about a 92-year-old grandmother, something needs to happen. Something needs to change. When you talk about unarmed citizens, proven to be unarmed, are killed, shocks the conscience.
Yes.
Something needs to change. And and it's only when you have that groundswell of community demand that something needs to change, that the change occurs. And that's how we got to the creation of ACRB, and that's how you got to get to the creation in some other areas. Now, I will say this. For some localities, why you want to wait until something like that happens?
Exactly.
It's easier to establish something before all of that happens, to establish oversight before all of that happens. That's how you can start having the real conversation about oversight. That's how you can really start educating the citizens and the officers and the elected officials about oversight. We don't want to wait until a tragedy happens. Oversight is good for everybody.
Exactly. Well, let me tell you, when I'm out doing outreach, very often we see people, this is very much of a tourist city. So you see people from all over coming to your booth. And very often they'll take a look at our material and say, well, I'm not from this area. But I always remind them, you're in this area now. You're under local jurisdiction right now.
Right.
So yeah, you got a point. So they'll come and they'll sign and they'll sign up with us and, become a part of our subscriber list, and all of that's good. And then at the end, they always invariably say at the end, we need something like this in our jurisdiction. We need something like this. So routinely, whenever I'm in the community doing outreach, someone wants to know how to create a civilian oversight agency in their town. We get inquiries from all over the country, as you know. Lots of cities, including Nashville, have studied the ACRB and emulated us. Now, we are always glad to help. So, Director Reed, what is the general process of creating an agency such as ours?
Well, the first thing for anyone thinking about oversight is to educate themselves on oversight. That includes visiting the NACO website, the National Association for Civilian Oversight Law Enforcement.
Do your homework.
Do your homework. Do your homework. That includes, as people have done, reach out to your local oversight agencies or oversight agencies in other states, because their oversight agencies run the gamut. You have some that do investigations like us. You have some that focus strictly on reviewing what the police department has investigated. You have some that just monitor investigations that come through the police department. You have some that only are involved in the policy and training recommendations. Then you have those hybrids, somewhat similar to us, that could do a whole range of things. When you look at our ordinance, there are a number of things that we're able to do. And all of these are based off of the demands and needs of the community. After you do your homework, then you want to start looking at uh, um, understanding what police misconduct looks like in your area. What does it look like in your area? What kind of complaints come through? Okay. How much money is the city or the area paying out? What's the sustained rate on citizen complaints? All of this is a part of that homework thing, because you're building the case. You want to start getting narratives or testimonies of what people have experienced in the area. Then you want to start talking with them. Now, once you get all of that done, and you understand what civilian oversight is, you understand what's happened locally, a history of what's happened locally with police misconduct, and you want to start looking at the different models, then you start piecing in your mind, okay, how could this oversight help us? You want to start looking at your building a coalition with other interested parties, finding other interested parties. That includes your churches. That includes your social justice organizations in the area. That includes your businesses in the area. That includes individuals, because you want to build a coalition of individuals who are saying, wait a minute, this is a great idea. We need to have this in our area, right? Then you want to start looking at, okay, in the elected officials of this area, who can I approach? Who understands this, has a willingness for me to educate them on this, on civilian oversight. And that's critical, because the person on that elected body is the one that's going to help you reach the other people on the elected body.
Right.
Because eventually it's going to come down to them creating legislation to create it. And it would help too to have petitions as you educate people about civilian oversight, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I always thought, petitions are about as old as the republic itself. And politicians are always responsive to that vote. They know somebody has a certain point of view, a certain criteria. They're going to follow that. How important are petitions? What part does that play?
I think petitions are important because, when you start having people sign the name of something, it starts to register with people, especially those people who receive the petitions. Like you said, oh, these are voters, or these are potential voters. These are people who are paying attention to what is happening in the community. So you want to build that, but you want to make sure that you are educating people so that they understand what is involved. Because as soon as you let the cat out the bag, so to speak, you have the naysayers and those who don't understand it and are basically want to protect status quo, trying to influence the public as well. Oh, we can't afford it. Oh, it's going to increase liability. Oh, it's going to be a problem. So you want to be able to deal with that by making sure that the community is educated, and you have a coalition that will be able to bring in people into the camp. Because you're going to need to be able to make sure people understand that oversight is not about anti-cop or anti-police. It's not about increasing liability of the city, and it's not about just having an activist organization that's creating issues. No, it's about accountability. It's about transparency. It's about making sure that policing serves the needs of the community as the community desires. So that's what we're going to be thinking about. That's what we should be addressing when we talk to these community members and elected officials. Okay, so once you got the elected official and an elected official on board, or a number of elected officials on board, then you want to start talking about what could it look like in this area. Now, depending on the history of the area, the types of complaints that the citizens have experienced, the willingness of the police department or law enforcement department, ability to address officer misconduct will help guide the type of oversight you want in the area. Some places may not be able to afford independent type of oversight, where you have dedicated staff working every day on these issues. Some places may only be able to afford having a smaller, scaled back type of oversight. Some places may only be able to afford having a commission or something that's set up that just reviews citizen complaints. You know, the main thing is that the agency has, or the commission has, independency of thought, that the police department, law enforcement department understands that it must work with the agency or entity, and that it will take the work of the agency, commission, organization seriously. Okay, so you got to have that there, right?
Yeah.
And then when we think about and so that's where the you know, we're looking at the money, the type of organization. Depending on the type, that's going to affect the money. That's going to affect who's going to be in that position, how people, I mean, who's going to be running that organization and included on that organization. Then you want to talk about, you know, well, how will these people be appointed to the board, if it's a board? You know, here we have a board and we have city staff. Board is appointed by different entities throughout the city to reflect the diversity of the city. And then you have the city staff that's hired by the ED's hired by the board, and then they hire the people to support the operation, right? Once you get through that, at some point, you have to engage law enforcement, because you want to know what they're thinking. You want to understand what they're saying are their challenges.
But don't we know what they're thinking? I mean,
Well,
don't we know what they're, in terms of, you know, them thinking, hey, police and all these other kinds of things, can civilians police us? Don't we already know that?
Well,
in some
see,
ways?
this is it though. You want to be able to knock all of that down.
Okay.
You know, you want to be able to address those points, right? Of course, most people don't want anybody in their business.
Right.
I mean, you look at any organization, any agency, even individuals. This is my house. I don't want you, my neighbor, in my house, my business.
It's human
right?
nature. Right. Right.
You know, it's just human nature.
Yeah.
But we as a society have agreed that there's certain times when somebody outside of your house is going to need to be involved. You know, law enforcement is no different than any other agency, any other entity. At some point, somebody needs to be involved. If you can't handle your business the way it needs to be handled, somebody needs to be involved. That's what you did. That's why the history of police actions in the area, the narratives, the testimonies are important, because you want to be able to say, nope, here's the problem. And what did you all do about these problems, right? And then you want to be able to explain to them, these are the benefits about civilian oversight. This is not a us against them situation. This is about how can we provide the best service, policing service, to the taxpayers who actually pay for this, right? So that's the way we want to approach it. We all should be able to agree that we want the best police officers on the street. We want the citizens and the community, and to be able to rely on the police to address concerns, right? We don't want people to have to engage in self-help. We want people to know that if I have a contact with the police, they're here to help the situation, not make the situation worse. You know, so these are things that we need to be able to address with the community. I mean, with the police department. And then, you know, as we go forward with the talking with the elected officials. Then we need to talk about the creation of the legislation, getting support for it. And one of the most important things is throughout all of this is keeping citizens engaged. Citizens have to be engaged. Even if there's a group of individuals saying we're going to start civilian oversight, we want to start civilian oversight. Well, guess what? Civilian oversight is about the community, not about the group. It's about the citizens living in that area. So they have to be involved in it. They have to be engaged. They have to have this two-way communication because that's who it's for, right? After the Civilian Oversight Agency is created, citizens have to remain engaged, remain involved, not only for filing the complaints, but to understand what the challenges are for the organization, for the agency or the entity. So these are things that have to happen. And then one other thing is, well, two other things. The first one is, well, let me go back. One thing I do want to say to our listeners is that Representative Sandra Scott out of Clayton County introduced the bill last year called HB 35, Ethical Policing Act. And in that act, it provides that every locality, county, city has to establish some form of oversight. I encourage individuals to go on the state legislature website, read that bill. There are a lot of things in that bill that could be game changers. Support that bill. This is saying that each community has to establish a form of civilian oversight. There are other things in that bill as well that go directly towards holding officers accountable. And again, this is not about being against police officers. It's about supporting police officers. Good police officers want to be supported. They want to have other good officers around. And honestly, when we think about the actions of bad officers or officers who are not following policies, that's bad for the community, bad for the department, bad for the taxpayers. So we all should be trying to address that issue. And civilian oversight is one of those things. And the last thing I'm going to say is this, Charles, because I see you looking like you got a question. I see, like, man, can you be quiet? The last thing is this, is that, oh, well, I forgot it. Anyway, go ahead.
I mean, you've been speaking almost 15 minutes about what has to be done. It's a lot of stuff. And obviously it requires a lot of patience and persistence. Little wonder that we're only one of the few independent agencies of its kind in the Southeast. So I tell citizens to be prepared for a long battle. Yes?
That's right. You're right. You're right. And, you're absolutely right, Charles, about the long battle. It's a long game. You continue to build, continue to have your evidence. And unfortunately, a lot of areas, they want to wait. The people sit back in their chairs and comfortable and say, well, it's not that bad here. So that allows them to kick the can down the road. So, well, it's not that bad here. We're not like Atlanta. We're not like, this area or that area. Well, two things. One, you're not experiencing what's happening. So you can sit back and in your confidence say that, right? Two, you're just kicking the can down the road until that incident occurs to where you got to jump around and start doing something. Going back to what I said earlier, The best time to establish it is before you get to that point. Before you get to that point, you know, you want to be able to put these things in place. And then, of course, just like with the ordinance here in Atlanta, over time, if you have to start small, you start small. Over time, you create, you address the citizens' concerns. If the current formation doesn't address their needs, then you make ordinance changes to grow it or bring in more power and authority or whatever, you know. So it's not something that's like, oh, well, they're asking for all of this. Well, okay, we can start it like this and then grow it. You know, so that's something that people have to keep in mind too.
Well, you touched on one point in your reading of what needs to be done in terms of the uniqueness of every community. Every community is different. And of course, Atlanta has a civil rights legacy. And I think that might play into what happens when you are expecting to develop something like this in your community. It's not only about the budget, it's about the history, it's about the culture. How does that play in?
Well, I think that that does play in, but there are other areas that do not have that history of civil rights, that have established oversight, and they established it because the people in leadership at that time were bold enough, understood the tea leaves, that things are happening that need to be changed, that we need to do something, right? That say, okay, let's do oversight. Let's try oversight. You know, so definitely I think it helped Atlanta being in the civil rights capital.
Sure.
But that's not to say other areas that may not have that history cannot establish civilian oversight. I was talking with a group last week or the week before last down in South Georgia. And, you know, they were really impressing upon me the fact that they're in a really rural area. And the challenges that they face, you know, trying to have something like oversight, just because the ruralness and the lack of funding and all of those things, you know, which are pretty daunting.
Sure.
But that goes back to the education piece and being able to say, this is why we need it. They've had some challenges down there when it comes to policing, and you're dealing with policing in the area where they may not have policies to address certain actions of the police officers. Yeah, you would think in 2020, 2021, every law enforcement department should have policies.
Right.
They were telling me that there were certain policies that they didn't even have in that law enforcement department. So that's a problem.
Of course it is.
And it's up to other agencies like ours and other agencies across the country and NACO to help and assist those communities with providing education, providing support, providing expertise to help them work through that.
And I think these communities should know, if they're interested, we always have our doors open to those who are interested, those who have coalesced, those who have come up with some sort of a plan and want to know exactly what to do. I mean, we've always opened our doors to them to let them know what needs to be done, correct?
Correct. And in fact, I'm working on a couple of documents now that that speaks directly to what this program has been about tonight. Starting civilian oversight, you know, in Georgia, and giving some tips and tactics and things to think about that hope to have completed shortly and have it reviewed, and we could put it on our website. You know, this is information that people need, people want, and wherever we can fit in to help, that's what we want to do.
Outstanding. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you have additional questions for us or like to file a complaint, please send us a chat message on our website, acrbgov.org, or give us a call at 404-865-8622. Look us up on social media. I'm Charles Curry, the Outreach Specialist, Public Information Officer for the Atlanta Citizen Review Board, substituting for our host communication specialist, Melissa Jean-Baptiste, who is under the weather this evening.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Lee Reed. We appreciate you. We'll talk again at 6 o'clock on the next Tuesday Night Talks.
All right. Good evening. Thank you.